The Rights of Man. The Rights of Man. By Thomas Paine. The Rights. Let's see. I'm curious about this book. I don't know. Haven't quite read it yet. And there's an introduction by Eric Foner. You can't read any of that. What am I even doing? Suggestions for further reading. A note on the text. The Rights of Man. From 39 to 279. So it's going to be 240 pages is the actual book. And then notes to part 1 and notes to part 2. There's the introduction here. It's going to be, how long is it? I feel like I should read introductions just because these people have studied this subject longer than I have. So it's nice to just hear what they have to say, but also, like, do I want to be spoiled? But, like, something like this, I don't know if you can be spoiled. I guess it's important to have a bit of context going in. So, from 7 to 23, we're going to listen to Eric Foner and go on and on about something. I'm burning. It's a screwdriver. Shouldn't drink. Don't drink, kids. This isn't for kids, but it's for everybody. I'll get my life together eventually, but today's not that day. Today's not that day. It's storm today. It's wet outside. How am I supposed to move all of this stuff outside to a different place? I don't know. So I'm reading The Rights of Man. The Rights. Introduction. I know not whether any man in the world has had more influence on its inhabitants or affairs for the last 30 years than Thomas Paine. So wrote John Adams in 1805. Neither a personal friend nor political admirer of Paine's, the conservative Adams believed that Paine's influence had, on the whole, been pernicious. In 1776, Adams had rushed to print to combat what he called the democratical philosophy of Paine's great pamphlet Common Sense. In the 1790s, he had ridiculed the spread of egalitarian ideas on both sides of the Atlantic as Paine's yellow fever, but Adams, like many of his contemporaries, were forced to admit that in an age of pamphleteering, Paine had become the greatest pamphleteer of all. In Common Sense and the Crisis papers, in America, The Rights of Man, The Age of Reason, and the Agrarian Justice in Europe, Paine had done more than bring the political issues of his time to an unprecedented popular audience. He had helped to create the very language of politics, the vocabulary in which men and women expressed timeless discontents, and in which men and women, and voiced aspirations for a better world. What's happening? Where am I at? Sorry. The slogans and rallying cry, aspirations of a better world. The slogans and rallying cries we associate with the late 18th century, the Age of Reason, the times that try men's souls, derive from Paine's writings. Most of all, Rights of Man, his greatest and most widely read work, remains today a classic statement of egalitarian democratic faith of the age of revolution. Striking as Paine's success as a pamphleteer was, it was no less remarkable than the trajectory of his life. Unlike most of the men who made the American Revolution, who sprang from the middle and upper class families long resident on American soil, Paine's origins lay among the lower orders of 18th century England. He did not even arrive in America until the very eye of the War for Independence, and never sank deep roots there. Where liberty is not, he once told Benjamin Franklin, there is my country. Nor is his ultimate legacy easily assessed. Unlike Jefferson, Washington, Adams, and his other contemporary, Paine was never accorded a place among his revolutionary leaders canonized in American popular culture. His memory was primarily kept alive by succeeding generations of radicals who found in him an outstanding symbol of resistance to established authority. Certainly Paine's early life gave no indication of the greatness he was to achieve. Born in Thetford, England in 1737, the son of a Quaker staymaker, i.e. a corset maker, and a local attorney's daughter, Paine spent the first 37 years of his life in obscurity. He attempted to make a living at his father's craft, later tried his hand as a teacher and a shopkeeper, and he served as an excise tax collector in Lewes, an unenviable position in a region where smuggling was virtually a way of life. Paine was well into middle age by the time he embarked for America, but so scanty his information concerning his early career that the formative influences which shaped his thinking remain largely unknown. Certainly, his father's Quaker faith influenced his later humanitarianism. Paine also developed a strong interest in Newtonian science, a common theme in the lives of 18th century reformers, who found in the harmonious Newtonian system based on natural laws a sharp contrast to governmental structures resting simply on the precedent and obviously irrational principle of hereditary rule. Paine had also had some contact with a group of London advocates of parliamentary reform, and may well have been influenced by underground currents of popular republicanism, dating back to the 17th century. But whatever these early influences, one thing is certain: not until he immigrated to America in 1774 did Paine find an environment capable of nourishing the seeds of his political discontent. Bearing a letter of introduction to Benjamin Franklin, whom he had met through mutual scientific acquaintances in London, Paine arrived in Philadelphia as the 10-year-old crisis between Britain and her American possessions was reaching a point of no return. The First Continental Congress had convened in the city in December of 1773, bringing to Philadelphia the most prominent leaders of the 13 colonies. Talk of political change agitated the city's clubs, taverns, and workshops. Paine secured a position as editor of the Pennsylvania Magazine, and in the months that followed made the acquaintance of Benjamin Rush and other leaders in the struggle against Britain. It was Rush who suggested that Paine write a pamphlet on the conflict, although he specifically warned him to avoid the word independence. Although war between British and colonial soldiers had broken out in Massachusetts in 1775, attaining the rights of Englishmen, not national independence, was still the avowed goal of most patriot leaders. Common Sense, Paine's remarkable pamphlet advocating the independence of America and the establishment of the Republican government, appeared in January 9th of 1776. And immediately caused a sensation. It outlined ideas that would continue to define the remainder of Paine's career: the superiority of the Republican government to monarchy, equality of rights among all citizens, and the world significance of the American Revolution. It also revealed Paine as a brilliant, innovative stylist capable of breaking with time-honored traditions of political writing to forge a new language which would reach out to a mass audience. Paine began Common Sense not with a discussion of American relations with Great Britain, but with an analysis of the nature of government. His most striking phrases were reserved for a savage attack on the so much boasted Constitution of England, and the very principle of hereditary rule. His description of the ascension of William the Conqueror 7 centuries earlier would become one of the most frequently quoted passages. A French bastard landing with an armed banditti and establishing himself king of England against the consent of the natives is in plain terms a very paltry, rascally, and original. The plain truth is that the antiquity of the English monarchy will not bear looking into. Far from Britain enjoying the most perfect system of government on earth, as even American leaders had contended, the king was nothing more than the royal brute of England, and the Constitution simply the base remains of two ancient tyrannies, compounded with new republican materials. The remains of monarchical tyranny in the person of the king, the remains of aristocratic tyranny in the persons of the peers. Paine called instead for the creation of a republican government based entirely on the representation of the people in a newly independent America, and a written constitution guaranteeing the rights of persons and property and establishing freedom of religion. Common Sense then turned to a discussion of independence, rebuting the arguments of proponents of reconciliation. There is something absurd, Paine wrote, in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. But he reserved his most eloquent words for a soaring vision of the meaning of American independence. Paine transformed the struggle over the sites of Englishmen into a conquest with meaning for all mankind. O ye that love mankind, ye that dare oppose not only tyranny but the tyrant, stand forth! Every spot of the old world is overrun with oppression. Freedom hath been hunted round the globe. Asia and Africa have long expelled her. Europe regards her as a stranger, and England hath given her warning to depart. Oh, receive the fugitive, and prepare in time an asylum for mankind. The immediate success of Common Sense was nothing short of astonishing. The pamphlet sold perhaps 150,000 copies and was credited with converting countless men and women to the cause of independence. One American announced, "You have declared the sentiments of millions. Your production may justly be compared to the land flood that sweeps all before it." We were blind, but on reading these enlightening words, the scales have fallen from our eyes. It was not what Paine had said was strikingly new. Many of the elements of his argument, the distinction between the old world and the new, the absurdity of hereditary privilege, even the possibility of independence, had been voiced before. What was new was the way in which Paine wove these themes into a coherent statement, and that the language in which he expressed them, a language aimed at extending political discussion beyond the narrow bounds of the 18th century's political nation. The first thing that struck contemporaries about Common Sense was its tone. Paine's daring impudence, the uncommon frenzy, as critics described it, the roots of his outrage, may well have lain in the years of disappointment in England, but Paine was indeed a conscious artist. He intentionally rejected the decorous and reasonable language of previous pamphlets in order to make a point that kings were simply men, entitled to no more deference and respect than they earned. And there was more to his literary style than his assaults on the monarchy. Addressing a mass audience unfamiliar with legal precedents, classical learning, and complex rhetoric, Paine strove for simplicity. The hallmarks of his style were clarity, directness, and forcefulness. He employed straightforward grammar and rarely referenced to any work other than the Bible. The message conveyed in his literary style was that of anyone could grasp the nature of politics and government. All that was necessary was common sense. In Common Sense and his subsequent writings, Paine outlined a vision of a republican government and society that would exert a profound influence on the transatlantic radical tradition. For Paine, a republic was simply a government devoted to the common good and equality of rights among its citizens. America, Paine believed, was uniquely fitted to create a republican government because of its relatively equal distribution of wealth, excepting, of course, black slavery. Excepting, of course. Jesus. In such a circumstance, governmental structures need not be particularly complex. Indeed, a central axiom of Paine's outlook, one that has led modern anarchists to claim him as an intellectual forebear, was the distinction between society and government. Society is in every state a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. Without the expensive and oppressive governmental systems of Europe, the courts, kings, and landed aristocracies, men and women could, Paine believed, dispense with familiar structures of government. Indeed, Paine contended that much of the misery of the old world derived not from economic exploitation, but from war, excessive taxation, political oppression, and corruption, all inescapable consequences of monarchy and hereditary right. Paine thus entered the multifaceted debate about the definition of republicanism that played so central a role in the political experience of the revolutionary generation. For Paine and other thinkers of the era, that was characteristics of republics. That was characteristic of republics. Oh. For Paine and other thinkers of the area, what was characteristic of republics was not so much a specific structure of government as a set of qualities among the citizenry. The key terms in a republican discourse were virtue, the willingness to subordinate selfish interest to the good of the whole; equality, which encompassed not simply equal treatments before the law, but also absence of vast disparity of personal wealth; and independence, the ability to resist outside coercion. All were seen to rest on a broad diffusion of private property among the citizens. Only property provided the autonomy that enabled men to exercise their political rights freely and to rise above their personal concerns to pursue the good of the entire society. Even Paine, while in America believed personal servants, propertyless men, dependent on others for a livelihood, should not exercise the franchise, although later in England he came to advocate universal male suffrage. Within the Republican tradition, of course, there existed numerous cross-currents and competing strands. Paine's version was shaped not simply by the writings of the English country party theorists, whose writings so strongly influenced 18th century American thought, but by his own experiences in England and America. An artisan himself, Paine had forged a special relationship with the radical artisan community of Philadelphia. Indeed, on both sides of the Atlantic in these years, artisans proved particularly receptive to the democratic egalitarian emphasis of Paine's republicanism. If American thinkers like Jefferson identified the yeoman farmer as the social basis on which a republican government should rest, and as the most virtuous of all citizens, Paine often spoke for the artisans of the cities. He was an urbanite, a cosmopolitan, and a strong proponent of economic progress. If Jefferson's republicanism looked to the past, fearing economic and social changes that threatened to undermine the small farmers' independence, Paine, like the artisan, embraced economic growth. To Paine, the past was a burden, not a guide, and the present only a temporary resting place from which to propel society into the future. Paine envisioned a society in which republican government, together with economic growth, would produce social harmony, equality, and economic abundance, in which all classes would share. Common sense marked Paine's emergence as a leading figure in the American struggle for independence. For the next several years, he was deeply involved in American affairs, writing the famous crisis papers to bolster the morale of the American army and to suggest solutions to some of the financial and political problems that confronted the new nation. He also took part in the conflicts that convulsed revolutionary Pennsylvania, influencing the state's 1776 Constitution, the most democratic frame of government of the period, and playing a role in the abolition of slavery in Pennsylvania in 1780. Yet, with the close of the War for Independence, Paine's interest in American politics began to wane. The problems of peace he found less stirring than the struggle for independence. Madame Roland, who came to know Paine during the French Revolution, made an astute observation about his cast of mind. I find him more fit, as it were, to scatter the kindling sparks than to lay the foundation, or prepare the formation of a government. Paine is better at lighting the way for revolution than drafting a constitution, or the day-to-day work of a legislator. By 1787, Paine was ready to return to Europe. The immediate reason was to promote his design for an iron bridge, one of several scientific inventions which he worked during his lifetime. But it came as no surprise to those who knew him that Paine soon found himself caught up in another political upheaval, this time in the land of his birth. Paine returned to England on the eve of the events that fundamentally transformed the political climate. The outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789 cast an ever-deepening shadow over English affairs, reinvigorating demands for political reform, but also inspiring conservatives to rally around king and country. In November of 1790, Edmund Burke published Reflections on the Revolution in France, which not only denounced the events in France and extolled the British political system, but unfolded a classic exposition of 18th century conservative thought. Authority, religion, morality, law. These were the crucial concepts in Burke's schema of politics. His central idea was that English liberties were an entailed inheritance derived to us from our forefathers, to be transmitted to our posterity. Society and government were like a family, in which each generation sought to transmit and slowly improve upon the traditions it had inherited. Gradual change might be acceptable, but a sudden overthrow of existing institutions would lead only to a sort of chaos that was convulsing France. Rebellion in one quarter, moreover, threatened the disintegration of the whole. So England had to quarantine herself against the contagion of revolution. For Burke, accumulated wisdom of the past was a far better guide to political behavior than abstract prattling about the rights of men, which had the dangerous tendency to overthrow long-established institutions and upset principles of natural subordination that stable government required of the body of the people. Prior to 1790, Burke had been known as a reformer, an advocate of the American cause in the 1770s and of relieving the political disabilities of Catholics and dissenters. He and Paine had become acquaintances of some intimacy in 1788 and in 1789, and had exchanged letters on developments in France. It was inevitable that their paths would diverge. To Burke, the fall of the Bastille proved the French were not fit for liberty, while to Paine it heralded the dawn of a new era of Europe. When mobs stormed Versailles in October of 1789, Burke wrote, "In France the elements which compose human society seemed all to be dissolved, and a world of monsters is to be produced in the place of it." Burke saw in France only anarchy. Paine perceived the unfolding of an age of revolution, in which republican principles, now legitimized by the success of the American Revolution, would be embraced in the Old World. Paine, moreover, knowing humble origins and difficult circumstances for most of his life, evinced a real compassion for the plight of the poor, while Burke's phrase, "the swinish multitude," made famous through ironic repetition by radicals, told more of his inner thinking than a host of legalistic arguments. Paine was not the first friend of the French Revolution to respond to Burke. Mary Wollstonecraft, Dr. Richard Price, and others had preceded him, but Paine's reply, "Rights of Man," became a classic defense not only of revolutionary France, but also of equality, democracy, and a new order for Europe. The Burke-Paine debate was a classic confrontation between tradition and innovation, hierarchy and equality, order and revolution. Dedicated to George Washington, the first portion of Rights of Man appeared on March 16th of 1791. In part, it was a vindication of the events in France. In part, a critique of the British system of government. Long sections narrated to overthrow the ancient regime challenging Burke's version of the storming of Bastille to the March on Versailles, and other events. Challenging Burke's version of the storming of Bastille, the March on Versailles, and other events. Paine was particularly outraged by the contrast between Burke's sympathy for the royal family and his studied indifference to the suffering of the old regime's victims. Not one glance of compassion, not one commiserating reflection that I can find throughout his book has he bestowed on those who lingered out the most wretched of lives, a life without hope, in the most miserable of prisons. He is not affected by the reality of distress touching the heart, but by the showy resemblage of it striking his imagination. He pities the plumage, but forgets the dying bird. Not one glance of compassion, not one commiserating reflection that I can find throughout his book has he bestowed on those who lingered out the most wretched of lives, a life without hope in the most miserable of prisons. He is not affected by the reality of distress touching the heart, but by the showy resemblage of it striking his imagination. He pities the plumage, but forgets the dying bird. Paine pointedly contrasted the new French system of government with its broad right of suffrage with that of England. Can anything be more limited and at the same time more capricious than what the qualifications are in England? He asked, as in Common Sense he reserved his sharpest barbs for monarchy and hereditary privilege. The idea of hereditary legislators is as inconsistent as that of hereditary judges or hereditary juries, or as absurd as an hereditary mathematician or an hereditary wise man.